I know, never come into the too much makeup
More
category.
natural. Well, I mean, if we do it for the TV show, we put some powder on
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
We don't. You know, it doesn't require heavy makeup.
Yeah.
The old cameras did more.
Okay, whenever you're ready.
Well, the first thing, Paul, I want to ask you about is, you know, generally speaking, before we dive into the report,
Mhm.
is why is this region so plagued by violence? What are the factors? I read one statistic in the literature: 200 armed conflicts since 1990.
Well, we think you could probably say that there are a number of different reasons why the Horn of Africa is so conflicted. But I think in the work we've been doing here at the centre, there's probably two or three main reasons why there's been so many armed conflicts there. The first reason we found was to do with the poor levels of governance and the rather repressive and authoritarian types of governance systems that we saw among a number of states in the region, which means if you look at them compared to other countries in the world, the 7, now 8 states in the Intergovernmental Authority and Development region come amongst the lowest levels of indicators for both levels of development and amongst the worst in terms of the indicators for repressive and authoritarian systems of governance. And so this has bred a number of grievances among all sorts of insurgency groups and non-state actors. So that would be a big part of the equation, number one. Secondly, we've also seen a really bad mix of sort of economic and poverty related factors. And although this doesn't automatically lead to conflict, there's no automatic correlation between poverty and economic deprivation and war. Added into the fact that there's a lot of visible inequalities in the region, some people have been doing and prospering relatively well and quickly in the last few years, whether this is through oil revenues or others. When people in poverty see massive inequalities and do not see the reasons as being particularly legitimate or fair, this again has had a reason to stimulate grievances. And then I think the third main reason that we found is probably to do with issues of natural resources. Particularly over land, water resources and environmental change that's been happening, particularly in the Horn of Africa in the last 20 or 30 years or so. And so we've seen at a very localized level, you see a lot of conflicts between tribal or clan groups, really focusing on issues of water scarcity, tensions over land ownership, and particularly the clash between sort of pastoral and more sedentary types of lifestyle. So I'd say those are the big three reasons.
And which direction are the trend lines headed in? You know, this like sort of almost a notion of science, nothing stays the same. It's either getting better or getting worse.
It's hard to generalize across the entire region here, but generally, although the situation is pretty bad in terms of the numbers of armed conflict the region's had, there's actually quite a lot of positive news in that the trend lines have actually been going down since the early 1990s. In particular, we've seen a number of big interstate and big civil wars in the region end in the last few years, or at least have peace agreements to bring them to a temporary end. Where there's been a real sort of ongoing fluctuation, there's not a whole lot of good news or positive trends either way, is in the more sort of non-state, localized armed conflicts around tribal issues and land, water-based conflicts. That's where we've seen the sort of the trend line's not really getting any better. But the big wars in particular, say between Ethiopia and Eritrea or between North and South Sudan have come to a close, at least with peace agreements.
One of the broadest suggestion, I suppose, is this notion of shifting to a conflict resolution and peace building lens.
Mm-hmm.
How does the world look different through that lens? In other words, compared to what? You know, in other words, what
Sure.
have we been doing that this would be a departure from?
Well, I think the way that the US government in particular, and it's the US government we focus on in these documents, the way the US government, I think, has engaged with the region has been largely through the lenses of regime stability, short-term order, and in particular concerns about terrorism challenges and transnational terrorism in particular. So it's looked at the region through saying, how can we, particularly in the short term and thinking about US presidential election cycles and other things, how can we in the short term get a reasonable degree of order, continuity, and avoid the type of terrorist attacks that we saw, for example, in 1998 on the US embassies in Kenya and Tanzania. And I think that's always been the guiding sort of modus operandi for US policy in the region. So when we say we'd like to see a shift towards a more an approach to engagement focused more on conflict resolution and peace building, we're meaning a number of differences to that. The first would be in terms of timescale. I think US engagement would be much more beneficial to the region and for US foreign policy if it started to take a much longer scale view of the problems confronting the Horn. And in that sense, we think that building strong, peaceful states that are able to deal with their own conflict issues is actually the best long-term antidote to dealing with issues of terrorism and civil war, not necessarily sort of dotting United States military bases or drone bases across the region to try and attack particular terrorists, but building long-term policies which help foster stable, democratic and regimes that can deal with their own problems. So that would be the first issue in terms of timescale. The second thing, I think, is a real switch in focus from what are the right instruments of US engagement in the Horn. And here I think the traditional focus on regime stability and counter-terrorism has meant that the military and the intelligence part of the US government has played the sort of priority role in a large number of the security challenges facing the Horn. And other types of actors, whether this is US aid or State Department diplomacy or civil society engagement, I think have been relegated to sort of second orders of priority. And so part of what we want to argue in putting a conflict resolution and peace building approach at the forefront of US policy is saying really the challenges that the region faces and the challenges that US foreign policy is most working about, we think are best tackled through non-military means in the long term. This doesn't mean there's no role for the US military to play in its, let's say in the Horn of Africa base in Djibouti, but it does mean that long term, even problems to do with terrorism and underdevelopment, these are political, economic and social challenges which are best addressed by experts in politics, economics and other forms of social interaction with the region. So I would say those are the two main issues, a different focus in terms of timescales and not really expecting so much to happen so quickly. And secondly, a real difference in the type of policy instruments that we think are going to be effective and a lot more focus on the sort of development and political engagement rather than military.
My final question is more of a sort of a make sure we don't miss a thing question. In the answer you just gave, you talked about some of the recommendations essentially.
Sure.
Are there anything recommendation-wise that we haven't talked about that you think it's important to mention?
Well, I would say the way we framed it in the paper, we see four big ideas that we think should help drive US engagement in the region and follow this conflict resolution and peace building approach. Number one, we think there's got to be a lot more listening done on the part of the US government. This is a confusing region to outsiders at the best of times. It's very difficult to understand what's happening in the sort of eye of the conflict storm in the region. And so the first recommendation we make is that the US government really needs to listen to a broader range of local voices, particularly non-state actors in civil society, to really understand why are people fighting, what are their central grievances, and how crucially can the US government help them deal with that. And then the second recommendation is it's not just about listening, we also need to enhance our own capabilities to actually understand local conflict dynamics better than we have done previously. And as we talked about before, part of the conclusion we came to in looking at the conflicts in the region was that many of them were based around really quite localized grievances, which not really to do with great sort of interstate level politics, but to do with very core provincial, regional, even sometimes village level tensions. As a result, we've got to think differently, I think, within the US government about how do we gather the type of information that's going to be crucial to understanding those things. And that will mean things like getting US personnel out from embassies in capital cities and getting them into a different mindset for how they gather information about conflict dynamics. And so getting them out to the peripheries, getting them to engage with more non-state actors and non-governmental channels. And then the third big recommendation we feel is that the US government doesn't need to take on the burden or the primary role of conflict resolution itself in the region. We think it can play its best role when it helps facilitate other locals. Ultimately, it's going to be local actors who deal best with local problems, and it's going to be local actors that fix these things in the long-term stable sense. But the US government can play an important role in facilitating, and we mean that in a number of senses. It can play a role with giving political support, it can give financial support, and it can also help provide financial support for training packages, trust building, and other types of conflict resolution mechanisms. But the thing that we recommend in particular is that it should help create some sort of regional forum in which local actors themselves can discuss what are the major challenges in terms of peace and security that we face across the region. Because as we identify in the report, one of the central problems is that the actors in the Horn, both state and non-state, don't have any degree of common consensus over the peace and security challenges that they face, let alone any common consensus about what's the best type of solution. So if we could facilitate a type of constructive and frank dialogue about how should we view the key peace and security challenges, which of those are common to all of us, how can we come up with common solutions and common ways of understanding the challenges, we feel that would be the best role that the US government could play in this situation.
Great. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Sounded good, Paul.
Yeah, terrific.